Been ready.
In today's gospel, Jesus orders what would be a very difficult task for a completely blind old man to accomplish. After he covered the man's eyes with his muddy spittle to awake him and make him focus on what is about to happen, Jesus says, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." The blind man knows how difficult it would be to find his way to this body of water through a mocking crowd, but he did. He obeyed Jesus, got into the pool of Siloam to wash off the dirt that was smeared all over his eyes. The blind man never hesitated to obey Jesus' order. After all, he waited for this moment of healing all the days of his life. The blind man took all the risks associated with obeying Jesus and finding his way to the pool of Siloam. He thought that regaining his sense of vision would bring him back to the ordinary life of society after decades of being ridiculed and rejected. But to his astonishment, when he told the Pharisees, his own community, that the man who healed him must be from God because only God can perform such a miracle, they threw him out, excommunicating him from the life of the temple and synagogue. Indeed, the blind man's reward for obeying Jesus was regaining his sense of sight. However, his obedience cost his life a great deal, losing his parents and his very own community. The blind man's obedience was in stark contrast to the Pharisees' action against Jesus. They disobeyed him, even calling him a sinner. How many times have we heard God tell us to go? To do something in his name? Perhaps the same number of times that we either question him, why? Why me? Why now? Or completely ignored him and denied that we ever heard him say, go. How many of us are like that young 34-year-old infectious disease doctor in Wuhan, China, who answered the call to treat patients infected with the coronavirus and who died a short time later, along with his own infected patients? How many of us would readily say yes to our calling unconditionally, especially upon knowing the risk associated of obeying the call? How many of us would be like the blind man who readily obeyed Jesus to go to the pool of Siloam, knowing he would risk his own life while going through the difficult path, and even more so, knowing what the rewards are for doing it? The trouble with our world today is that we readily hesitate to give up our material, emotional conveniences. We quickly hesitate to give up ourselves, and we readily disobey God's commands. Like the man born blind, we were born spiritually blind because of the sin of disobedience that we inherited from Adam and Eve. We are like Jesus' disciples who believe that bad things happen to us, just like the coronavirus outbreak, because we disobey God. We are like the Pharisees who disobey God because we think we know better than God does. Yet, despite our disobedience of God's calling that made us become polluted with sin and evil, a state when we were altogether not lovable, God's heart was full of love for us, not contempt. He would not leave us suffering even more because of our disobedience and sinfulness. Because he loved us, God gave his own Son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for our redemption. Christ died there to remove the obstacle of sin, of disobedience between God and us. As John 3:17 affirms, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Imagine what the consequence would have been if the blind man disobeyed Jesus. The blind man's sight was completely healed, but not immediately following Jesus' smearing his eyes with his muddy spittle. The blind man was healed only after he chose to fully obey Jesus' command to go immerse himself in the pool of Siloam. A metaphor for the man embracing Jesus at baptism, worshiping him for the rest of his renewed life. There stood Jesus telling everyone that this poor blind man, unloved and rejected by his own community, still counted, and that his life could serve as proof of the grace of God. Because of his obedience, his physical blindness, and more importantly, his spiritual blindness was healed, opening his eyes to a new perspective about his past and his future with Jesus Christ. Unlike this blind man, we often find ourselves questioning God's call and talking ourselves out of obedience, rather than blindly trusting and obeying his command to go. God allows us pain, struggles, and adversities in our daily lives. But regardless of our circumstances or limitations, when we choose to take that leap of faith with blind obedience, trusting God even when we don't know what lies ahead, we too can experience true spiritual healing, see a new perspective about our past sinfulness for the very first time, and take that first step into discovering our renewed purpose in Christ. By the grace of God, through our spiritual eyes, we will soon believe that the man called Jesus is also a prophet. Not just any prophet, but one sent from God. Ultimately, through our obedience, the full splendor of spiritual light is shown forth when we finally say, "I do believe, Lord," and we worship Jesus.